The sea never forgot what it was owed. In the 18th century, when wooden ships ruled the oceans, men who served aboard them lived between the masters, the captain above them, and the endless deep below. Both demanded obedience, both punished defiance to the outside world. A naval vessel was a symbol of order, courage, and empire. But inside, beneath the deck where salt and sweat mixed into one sour air, there existed another reality, a world where pain kept the law alive. For many sailors, the threat of death was not the greatest fear. The greater terror was surviving the punishments that came before it. Every man aboard knew the code. The captain's word is law. That wasn't a saying. It was survival. From dawn to dusk, sailors climbed, scrubbed, and hauled until their hands bled. But a single mistake, a loose knot, a dropped rope, a disrespectful word, could mean a punishment designed not to kill, but to remind. Flogging was the most common and the most dreaded. The cat o' nine tails, a whip of 9 knotted cords, was kept coiled in plain sight, a warning hanging from the mast. Its leather strands were embedded with bits of metal or glass, sharpened just enough to bite through flesh. The bosun's mate, the man appointed to wield it, was chosen not for mercy, but for precision. The crew would be assembled on deck, the offender stripped to the waist, tied to the grating, his back arched and exposed. Then came the sound every sailor feared, the whistle's sharp cry, followed by the first crack of the whip. One stroke ... 20. The skin didn't just break, it split. Blood soaked the deck planks. Salt water was later poured into the wounds, not as cruelty, but as cleansing. The official logbook would record it as discipline administered. But there were punishments even worse. If a sailor was accused of mutiny, cowardice, or theft, crimes seen as betrayal to the entire ship, he might face keelhauling. The very word chilled blood. The condemned man would be bound with ropes and dragged beneath the ship's hull, from one side to the other. The bottom of the vessel was crusted with barnacles and razor-sharp growths. As the sailor's body scraped against them, the sea tore skin from bone. Sometimes the man emerged alive, gasping, shredded, but breathing. Others never came back up. Those who did were left as living warnings, their backs flayed open, their eyes wide with a kind of horror words couldn't capture. To some captains, mercy was weakness. The ship had to run like a clock, and fear was the oil that kept its gears from rusting. Still, not all punishments were about the lash. The ocean itself was used as an accomplice. A sailor who drank too much fresh water, who insulted an officer, who fell asleep on duty, he might be ducked as punishment. Tied to a rope and plunged into the freezing sea, hauled up only long enough to cough before being dropped again. The crew would count 1, 2, 3 until the man stopped struggling. Other times, offenders were left mast-bound, tied upright to the mainmast for hours or days, through rain and wind, with nothing to drink but the salt air. The sunburn by day, the cold nod by night. Gulls would circle, shrieking, waiting. It was said that after a day of mass binding, the mind began to drift, not from madness, but from surrender. There were also subtler cruelties, the kind no log ever recorded. Salt rations deliberately spoiled, water mixed with vinegar, weeks of silence from crewmates who'd been ordered not to speak to a man under punishment. This social exile was a punishment worse than any lash, because it stripped away the only thing that kept men sane at sea: belonging. For all this, there were no prisons aboard those ships, no courts of appeal. The deck itself was both courtroom and scaffold. The captain judged, sentenced, and watched. Every act of punishment reinforced his authority and reminded the men what awaited those who challenged it. Some captains were known for their cruelty, others for restraint, but even the kindest were forced by the system to become instruments of fear. A single act of leniency could spark whispers of weakness, whispers that could grow into disobedience, or worse, mutiny. The paradox was brutal. To command men, one had to terrify them. To maintain order, one had to break it. There are records of sailors punished to the point of madness, men who, after weeks in irons below deck, began to talk to the sea itself. They would whisper apologies to the waves, beg the wind to carry them home, cry out to the ship as if it were listening. Sometimes, in the black hours before dawn, the crew would hear a splash, another man overboard. Whether he jumped or was pushed didn't matter. The sea swallowed both without question. What made it worse was that punishment wasn't only physical. It was psychological warfare. The fear of the lash was constant. It lived in the creak of ropes, in the shuffle of boots on the deck. It lived in the quiet glances between men who knew that any of them might be next, and yet they stayed. Because desertion was a crime, too, if caught. A deserter faced the noose or the firing squad. Many weighed their choices, a slow death under the whip or a quick one by bullet. The sea offered no mercy either way, but there were moments, fleeting ones, when the punishments stopped, when storms forced men to work together or die together. In those hours, hierarchy dissolved. Officer and sailor became equals, bound by the same terror. And yet, when the waves calmed and the sails were mended, the order of pain returned as if it had never left. For some, the cruelty was a badge of pride. Surviving punishment meant toughness, proof that one belonged. To the brotherhood of the damned, scars were worn like medals. But for most, they were reminders, carved into flesh, that the ocean didn't forgive mistakes, and neither did the men who commanded it. The ships that sailed the Atlantic, the Caribbean, the Indian seas, they carried trade, conquest, and empire. But hidden below their decks were the stories of men who became ghosts long before they died. And in every splash of salt water, in every groan of the hull, their suffering was carried forward, into history, into legend, into silence. Some stories survived, scratched into journals, whispered in taverns, or written by men who somehow lived long enough to tell them. One of them was Thomas Harwood, a sailor aboard the HMS Victory. In 1748, his crime, talking back to a lieutenant, a single insult spoken in the wrong tone. The punishment was 24 lashes. Harwood received all 24, though by the 12th he could no longer scream. The boatswain as mate paused only to dip the cat o' nine tails into a bucket of salt brine before continuing. They said Harwood lived for 3 more days. On the 4th, fever took him. His body was wrapped in canvas, weighted with stones, and dropped into the gray sea. The captain wrote only 5 words in the logbook: discipline maintained, man deceased. Another case, one that still echoes in maritime lore, was the keelhauling of a Dutch sailor named Jan de Vries in 1628. The ship had been anchored off the coast of Java when Jan was accused of theft, stealing a silver spoon belonging to an officer. He swore he was innocent, but on deck, innocence meant nothing if the captain's honor was at stake. Jan was tied hand and foot, a heavy rope looped around his body. At the captain's command, the crew hauled him overboard, pulling him under the keel. The sea swallowed him whole. When he emerged on the other side, he was barely recognizable, his face torn, his skin hanging in strips. They say he lived just long enough to curse the captain with his last breath. Even after such horror, the practice continued, for order, they said, for example, for the empire. By the mid-1700s, flogging had become almost ritualistic. Some captains would order flogging around the fleet, a punishment so severe it required the condemned man to be rowed from ship to ship, each crew administering a set number of lashes. The journey could last days, the punishment longer. Most didn't survive to the end. Those who did were carried off as living skeletons, the smell of blood following them like a shadow. But there were men who began to question the cruelty. Officers who'd seen too much, who'd watched loyalty die under the lash. In secret letters and private journals, they wrote of the shame, the senselessness, the screams that haunted them through the night. One letter, written by an anonymous midshipman in 1790, said, "We claim to rule the waves, yet we cannot rule our own wrath. The sea takes enough without our help. Must we give it our own as sacrifice still?" The system endured. For lower deck sailors, survival depended on silence. Speaking up meant mutiny, and mutiny meant death. The word itself, mutiny, was the most feared aboard any ship. It was the line no man could cross, and yet desperation sometimes drove them there. In 1797, at Spithead and the Nore, two massive mutinies broke out in the British Navy. Sailors demanded fair pay, better food, and an end to cruel punishment. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the whip would finally lose its power. But when the rebellion failed, dozens of men were executed. Their bodies hung from the yardarms as warnings to others. The message was clear: discipline first, humanity second. Even in death, punishment was a spectacle. Bodies wrapped in chains hung along the coastlines, left for gulls to feed on. The sea breeze carried the stench of what the Empire called justice. But for every sailor broken, there were hundreds more who endured, who bore the scars, the silence, the nightmares, because they had no choice. To live meant to obey, to question meant to suffer, and to rebel meant to vanish into the deep. In the end, these punishments did more than scar flesh. They eroded the soul of an entire generation of men. They learned to trust no one, to feel nothing, to swallow pain as part of duty. The ocean didn't care for prayers, and neither did those who commanded it. As centuries passed, the practice of flogging and keelhauling began to fade. New laws, new codes, new nations emerged that condemned the old ways. But the memory of those punishments, and the men who endured them, still lingers in the maritime world. Every time a ship's hull groans in the tide, every time ropes tighten in the wind, it's said the sea remembers. The cries, the lashes, the splashes, echoes of justice twisted into cruelty. The ocean holds their ghosts, and if you listen close enough, you can almost hear them. The voices of men who learned that at sea, discipline was another word for pain. Their suffering became the foundation of naval order. Their silence the price of progress. But history doesn't forget the truth. It only buries it in waves. If you want to uncover more forgotten stories like this, the punishments, the prisons, and the truths history tried to wash away, make sure you subscribe, like, and share this video. Let's keep the voices of the lost alive, and bring the darkness of the past into the light. Because behind every legend of the sea, there's a scream the wind still carries.